we also have a crowd on Facebook. So there are more faces even than just what we see here that are listening and watching. So again, thank you all for being here. I'll give you just a few announcements. It is, we are so happy to welcome today author and civil rights activist, Dr. Bob Zellner. First, just a few announcements. The History Museum of Mobile is open. I hope that you were all able to see the ancient Rome exhibit before it closed. The education department is now offering tours for up to 20 people. So just raising that, expanding that group a little bit, up to 20 people on weekdays. If you're interested in a guided tour, you can contact the curator of education, Jennifer Teak. Museums are a great place to social distance. So really wonderful. We have some great upcoming exhibits where you can do just that. The exhibit that we're really excited to open very, very soon is a history of Mobile in 22 objects. We've published this beautiful catalog that's going to be released on October 30th as well. So hope that everyone will come and see this exhibit. It's 22 unexpected and compelling objects that weave together over 300 years of Mobile history. And the exhibit has really been, and certainly the catalog has been written by professors and historians and curators from all over the community, lots of very familiar names. Beyond that, our next big exhibition that we're excited to announce is Egyptian Mummies and Eternal Life. That's a really special exhibit. It opens on February 26th of next year and features over 100 ancient artifacts, including mummies, painted sarcophagi, funeral trousseau, all of these wonderful artifacts that tell the story, explain the history of mummification and beliefs about the afterlife in ancient Egypt. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Zellner. Again, thank you so much for being with us. Dr. Bob Zellner was raised in South Alabama, graduated from Murphy High School in 1957. He attended Huntington College in Montgomery, where he took a course in race relations and attended a workshop held by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which of course we know as SNCC. Though threatened with expulsion for his involvement with student protest, graduated in 1961 with a degree in psychology and sociology. He was then hired by SNCC to recruit white students for the movement. Until 1962, he was their only white field secretary. With SNCC, he worked in Georgia and Mississippi on desegregation, voter registration, the formation of the LaFleur County Freedom Democratic Party. In 1964, he investigated the murders of civil rights workers in Neshoba County. And then in 1966, he moved to New Orleans to work with the Southern Conference Educational Fund. And in the 1990s, he earned a doctorate in history from Tulane University. I certainly sympathize with that. I'm finishing my doctorate from Tulane right now in history and art history. So wonderful to make that connection. Upon his retirement, he taught the history of the civil rights movement at Long Island University. And in 2008, which is what we are here to talk about today, he published a memoir, The Wrong Side of Murder Creek, a white Southerner in the freedom movement. Today, he will discuss this book and share his history. So please join me as I see we have a crowd of other people continuing to join us. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bob Zellner. We're so glad to have you here speaking with us at the History Museum. Welcome.
Thank you, Meg. Thank you. And thank you, Jennifer, and all the technicians who are working on this. We didn't have this when I graduated Murphy High School in 1957. So if you do the math, that makes me 81 years old. So I'm very honored to be a part of the Mobile History Museum. And because I've lived a lot of that Alabama history and Mobile history. And it's a delight to speak to people who know our state and know our region and some of the history of the region. It is true that I grew up in, as I say in most of my lectures, and I get a little chuckle, I say I grew up in LA, and of course everybody in Alabama knows that's Lower Alabama. And it was very unlikely, Meg, that I would be uh, ever involved in the civil rights movement because my father and grandfather were members of the Ku Klux Klan. And both mother and dad graduated from Bob Jones College, which was not far away from here. It was in Northwest Florida at that time. They're both graduates of Bob Jones College. And I'm named after Dr. Bob Jones. He's my godfather. And I think as things turned out, I was one of his biggest disappointments because I was able to break out of the history of segregation and racism that I was raised in and become a part of one of the major events in American history, the civil rights movement. So I'm very happy to talk about that. We're still living that history and we're still dealing with things that happened 50 or 60 years ago as if they happened 50 or 60 days ago. So it's a great privilege to speak to you and all of the friends and supporters of the History Museum.
Let me jump in and say one thing that I forgot to say, and then I'm going to completely turn it over to you. And that is that people are welcome to leave questions as you go, to leave questions in the chat box at the bottom of the Zoom, or if they're able to join on Facebook, to leave questions in the Facebook comments area. And we will, at the end of this, I will come back on and moderate questions and be able to kind of facilitate asking those questions. So if anyone that's with us would like to put some questions in the chat box, we'll be sure to see those. So I will leave. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. And also, I really appreciate the questions and comments. You know, it doesn't have to be in the form of a question. You can make a comment. And I've asked my partner in organizing,
your wife,
my wife, Pamela, and I've asked her to try to let me know after about 15 or 20 minutes. That's about the maximum that I can talk.
He actually talks a lot longer.
Yeah, she says, I think I talked 12 minutes and it's 40 minutes later. So she's going to help time me. Anyway, I was born in Jay, Florida, which is in Lower Alabama. It's about 5 miles south of Bruton, Alabama, and East Bruton, Alabama. And it's one of the reasons that my memoir is called The Wrong Side of Murder Creek, because when I grew up in East Bruton was separated from Bruton by Murder Creek. And anybody that lived in East Bruton was considered a poor person and somebody who was not likely to go very far in life. So as a small boy, I remember people looking down and saying, boy, you're on the wrong side of Murder Creek. So that's why I called my memoir The Wrong Side of Murder Creek. And also I must hasten to correct part of the introduction, because I did study for a PhD in history at Tulane University. And it was very wonderful of Tulane history department, and especially Professor Larry Powell, who was my dissertation advisor, to suggest and allow me to write 3 chapters of my memoir as my master's thesis. And if I finished the memoir, it would be considered my dissertation. And I remember asking if anybody else had ever done a memoir as a PhD history dissertation, and they said they only knew of one, and that was Winston Churchill. So I thought I was in pretty good company. And I must admit that my memoir never would have been written if I hadn't started writing at Tulane. And so I thank Tulane for the fact that I was able to have a book, and it's now been made into a film here in Alabama. And that never would have happened if I hadn't been in the history department at Tulane. But I have yet to receive my PhD. I do have several doctorate degrees, but they're all honorary doctorate degrees. So anyway, to clear that up. I went through the 10th grade in East Bruton, Alabama, at W.S. Neal High School. And my first knowledge of Mobile was when our marching band, I played trombone, when our marching band would go to Mobile for the Mardi Gras parades, and we'd be a band in the Mardi Gras parades. And then later, we went to New Orleans for Mardi Gras. And I liked New Orleans so much that at one point I moved to New Orleans to do one of our organizing projects in 1967 or 68, which we call GROW, Grassroots Organizing Work. And that was after being in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, since its founding staff in 1961 to 1967. Then it became necessary for all of the white people who had been working in SNCC to begin to work with white Southerners, especially poor and working class white Southerners, and to bring them into joint work and coalitions with the civil rights movement and all the organizations and people who were working for equal rights and economic opportunity for poor people. So one of the reasons that we moved from East Bruton, Alabama, to Mobile, Alabama, is that my father was a Methodist minister. And so my father's story is really the main part of my memoir about how he grew up in Birmingham with a father who was into Ku Klux Klan. His brothers were all members of the Ku Klux Klan, and even his sisters were members of the Women's Auxiliary, because the Ku Klux Klan didn't allow any women in their organization, so they were in the Women's Auxiliary of the KKK. So it was very unlikely that I would ever become a part of the movement. But my experience at Murphy High School led me in the direction of the movement. And then when I went to Huntington College, which is our Methodist school in the Alabama West Florida Conference of the United Methodist Church, that's where I met Dr. King, and I met Mrs. Rosa Parks and E.D. Nixon and the people who made the Montgomery bus boycott. And they mentored me and started me on a life of crime. So that's a brief history of how I got to Huntington College. But I want to talk for a minute, since we're in Mobile, about my experience at Murphy High School. I was in Murphy for my 11th and 12th grade. I had started my education when we lived near Dothan, Alabama, right outside of Fort Rucker, in Loxley and Slocum, Alabama. And I had a very troubled start in my education because I was moderately to severely dyslexic, and they knew that there was some learning disability for some children, and they couldn't learn to read. So I had difficulty learning to read because of my dyslexia. And luckily, my mother was a school teacher, and she had two sisters who were also school teachers. And they all said that Bobby, which is what they called me when I was a child, they said Bobby is not mentally retarded. Even though he can't read, he's in the 3rd grade and can't read yet. They knew that there was something unusual about my difficulty in school. And so they began to research the situation, and they discovered a doctor in Germany that had described what dyslexia was and how it worked. And it was originally called word blindness. And the only place in Alabama at that time that dealt with that was Barton Academy on Government Street in Mobile. So at the time, Daddy had been assigned to the church, Methodist Church in Loxley, Alabama, which is not too far from here. And so Mother and Dad arranged for me to go live with my Aunt Peg and Uncle Douglas Pope in Mobile. So even as a third grader or a fourth grader, I lived on Old Government Street near Murphy High School. So I finally learned to read when I was in about the third grade. And so I skipped the fourth grade and went to the fifth grade and caught up with my class. But most of my, the rest of my education, I never thought of myself as a smart person or a particularly intelligent person. And it was amazing when I got ready to graduate at Murphy High School. They said that I was one of the top students and I was eligible to be a graduation speaker. And that terrified me because I had stage fright, terrible stage fright. And I was active in the MYF, which is the Methodist Youth Fellowship. So I was speaking a lot, and I was always very nervous and terrified for speaking. And I said, well, I don't care to be a graduation speaker. Thank you very much. But my church group, Jamie Cecil was my special friend, and she went to Dauphin Way Methodist Church, which was not far from Murphy High School. And we had a little prayer group that we usually went after school once a week over to Dauphin Way Methodist Church, and we had a little prayer and meditation circle for high school students. And when I told Jamie that I had been asked if I wanted to be a graduation speaker, and I told her that I had declined the invitation, she said, no, you need to be a graduation speaker and represent the church youth. So I said, well, okay, if the group thinks that's important, I'll be willing to do it, but I have to have help from the group. So we formed a little group, and it turned out that our graduating senior class at Murphy in 1957 was about 2,100 students. So that was during the beginning of the baby boom, and we had a huge senior class, and there were about 15 or 20 people who were eligible to be valedictorian or salutatorian or whatever they called it in those days. And so they were going to have only 4 speakers, and so they were going to have a speaking contest and let the students at Murphy vote on who was going to be their graduation speakers. So we began preparing for the contest, and somebody in our little group said, well, in the first round of the contest, about 15 or 20 people are going to speak, and the only way you have a chance of making it to the next level will be that people will remember your speech. And so it has to be something that they will remember. And somebody else said, well, if it's funny, they probably will remember it. So let's do a funny speech. Now, I had never been a comedian before, so we wrote the speech. I mean, word for word, we wrote the speech. And the speech was, they had given us some subject or something. And the subject was high school students through the ages, through all of human history. And so we decided to do our speech on a high school during the caveman era. So we wrote the speech about a young boy, young caveman who had a pink polka dot dinosaur, which he rode to school every day. And that was during the time when everybody had hot rods and this, that, and the other. So we fashioned a whole world of caveman high school. And in giving the speech, I remember that people were laughing through the whole thing. And I said, well, man, that's amazing. So that meant that they were listening, and probably meant that they would remember that speech. So afterwards, I did make that cut, and then we did another speaking thing, and finally we got down to the final four, and I was told that I would be a speaker at Murphy High School graduation, which to me was a great honor. Now, what was another thing that was happening at the same time at Murphy in 1957, probably my junior year, actually, at Murphy High School. And that was the year, this era of Autherine Lucy being the first Black student to go to the University of Alabama. And so naturally, there was a tremendous amount of conversation and discussion among us high school students at Murphy about Autherine Lucy going to the University of Alabama as the first Black student. And I remember that that was a time when I first became somewhat aware that my attitude and my feelings about Autherine Lucy going to the University of Alabama was completely out of step with the vast majority of my peers in high school, and also not to mention the population of Alabama. Because every time the conversation, the topic came up, I would say that I thought it was a good idea for Autherine Lucy to go to the University of Alabama. And my peers in high school would say, well, you can't possibly mean that. It's going to destroy the university. And I remember trying to think myself, how can one student destroy an entire university with the long history that this university has? And they'd say, well, I'd say, what do you mean she's going to destroy the university? And they'd say, well, you know what I mean. And I said, yeah, I know. It's going to destroy segregation, our Southern way of life. And so that way we would get into a discussion of integration, segregation, and the history of racial inequality in the South. And that's when I first realized that there's something, I'm different in some way. And I began to think about it, and I realized that it was mainly because my father had been able to take the long trip from the KKK to being a decent human being. And so I became very interested in asking my father how he was able to break from the Ku Klux Klan and become a controversial but decent human being as a Methodist minister. And so he told me about, as a young college student, he was selected by Dr. Bob Jones, who was the president of his college, to go to Europe in the middle of the 1930s, around 1935 or 1936, to start a fundamentalist Christian center or institution in the middle of Europe. And my father explained to me that Hitler was already had been elected or appointed chancellor, and he was now a brand new dictator of Germany. And the whole world was beginning to line up on the side of the fascists or against the fascists. And he said it was incredible that Dr. Bob Jones would think that it was a good time to go and try to convert the Jews of Europe to be Christians. And they also said they needed to convert the Catholics to be Christians because the Ku Klux Klan ideology demonized Jews and Catholics and immigrants of all kinds. And so I said to my father, wouldn't converting Jews to be Christians in this situation be similar to converting people at the edge of a sword? And he said, that's right. And I said, well, Dad, did you convert any Jews? And he said, no, but they converted me. He said, I went as a loyal, faithful Klansman and a racist to Germany and Poland. While he was in Europe, he was in Germany, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, and parts of the Soviet Union. And he said, I didn't convert any Jews, but they converted me. And then I was very interested in him telling me the story of his experiences in Europe. And that's when he told me the story of his change of heart, because I was able to say to my father, I can understand, because he told me stories about going to the little underground churches all over Europe and in parts of the Soviet Union, where Christians would get together in secret to worship. And and he said, while I was in Germany, I had to dodge the Gestapo. If I was in Poland, I had to dodge Pilsudski's secret police. And if I was in the Soviet Union, I'd have to dodge the KGB. And he said, I was going from one little group of Jews to another group of Jews, and I was taking messages and sometimes some money. And he realized that he was doing things now in Europe to help the people that he had come to convert and help. And he realized that if he was found with these messages and money, he would probably be imprisoned and might be executed. So I said, well, I can see how you would have a philosophical change and you would not be able to, you would identify more with the victims of Nazis than the Nazis themselves. And he said, that's what happened. And he told me one time he was in Berlin in a restaurant. And all of a sudden, everybody jumped up and ran out the door. And he asked someone who spoke English what was happening, and they said, "Oh, Hitler is passing in the next street, and everybody's going to go see Hitler." And Dad said, "I just sat back down and finished my dinner. I had no interest in seeing Hitler." So, but anyway, I said, "Well, that's an amazing thing." But I said, "Something happened inside your heart." And then he told me the story. He said, well, I had been traveling in Russia for 8 months in the dead of winter. and said Dr. Bob Jones and the other people who had come over here to Europe with us had all gone back to America. And I was traveling with just an interpreter and a guide. And we were going to all these little churches. And he said, it had been so long since I'd been home. He said, on this little circuit of underground churches we were going to, we joined up with a group of gospel singers from Georgia. And he said they were all African Americans. They were all people of color. They were black people. And he said, I hadn't heard any English spoken in so long. And he said they spoke not only English, they spoke Southern English. And he said, we talked about food. He talked about hot biscuits and country ham and sliced tomatoes and okra. And he said, I thought I was having a nervous breakdown because one day I forgot they were black. And he said, I was so concerned about that. I had a conversation with myself and I said, this is very important now. They're black and you're white. And you have to remember that. But Dad said, it became such an effort. He said, I decided that, I just want my handkerchief. He said, I decided while I'm here in Europe, I'm going to forget about black and white. He said, because all the people here, they just call us the Americans. And he said, they don't make any distinction between the white Americans and the black Americans. He said, we're just Americans. And he said, we sang the same songs, we prayed the same prayers. And I just decided to just be a human being with them. And he said, that ruined me as a Klansman. So that stuck with me as a small child. And so that when I was at Murphy High School and they talked about Arthur and Lucy going to the University of Alabama, I knew it would be a good thing for the University of Alabama, and it would be a great thing for the people of Alabama. So that was part of my introduction. That's the place I was when I went to Huntington College in Montgomery in the fall of 1957. And that was very soon after the victory of the Montgomery bus boycott, which many people see as the beginning of the modern civil rights movement, the Montgomery bus boycott. So I enrolled at Huntington as a ministerial student, and it was in my senior year, one of my majors was sociology, and I had to have a certain number of credits in sociology. So, and I was particularly interested in it as well. In my senior year, there was a class called Race Relations. And so I took that class, and it was not unusual for sociology departments at that time in 1959 or 1960, by this time, it was not unusual for them to have sociology classes on race relations because most everybody understood that you did your research in the library. You just read books. Well, 5 of us in the class, being unusually good students as we were, we decided that we would read all the books. And you could read the 5 or 6 books that you needed to read. The American Dilemma, Caste and Class in a Southern Town, Dollard, you could read all the books on race relations. And then we realized that we were in Montgomery, Alabama, where one of the great experiments in race relations was undertaken. And in fact, the assignment itself said, study the racial problem and write a paper about solutions to the problem. So it was a great assignment. But you couldn't possibly, we didn't think that you could do that assignment in Montgomery, Alabama, without investigating what happened in the Montgomery bus boycott, because it did solve one of the problems of race-related problems in Montgomery and in Alabama, and that was segregation on the public buses. And we knew, and we told our professor, Dr. Arlie B. Davidson, we said, Dr. Davidson, people have come from all over the world to Montgomery specifically to study what happened during the Montgomery bus boycott and why it was successful, because it was the use of Gandhian nonviolence and non-participation, passive resistance it was first called. It was a good example of it being successful. And our professor said, well, you can't do that. And we said, why? And he said, because you'll be arrested. And being young sociology students, our sociological imagination was piqued by the idea that you could be arrested doing research for a college paper. And we said that to our professor, and he said, you don't know the first thing about race relations in Alabama. And we said, that's right, that's why we're taking your course. And so we decided, 5 of us, that we would go meet Dr. Martin Luther King, and we would see if he and Mrs. Rosa Parks and Mr. E.D. Nixon, all who helped lead and make the Montgomery bus boycott, we would see if they would do an interview with us so we could learn what we could from the people who actually conducted the boycott. And so we met Dr. King at a federal court building. That's where you could find him usually in those days, in court somewhere. And so we went down to the federal courthouse in Montgomery on a day that he was on trial, along with a lot of the other ministers in Montgomery. And during one of the recesses, we found Dr. King standing in the hall, and the 5 of us introduced ourselves, and we shook hands, and we told him we were students at Huntington, and we wanted to interview him and Ms. Rosa Parks. And we had heard about a nonviolent workshop that was being held at Reverend Abernathy's church, and where Dr. King would speak, and Mrs. Rosa Parks was coming back to Montgomery for that. And we asked him if we could come. And Dr. King looked at us and said, well, you're certainly welcome to come, but you should be prepared to be arrested. And we were a little bit surprised, and we said, well, that's what our sociology professor said. And he said, well, that's why he's a professor. He knows that you would be challenging the segregation laws in Montgomery, and you might be arrested. So we said, well, we don't think we'll be arrested. We're just doing research for a paper. We're not taking sides. And he said, well, come ahead. So 5 of us did go to the workshop, and that's where I first met John Lewis. And it was a wonderful day. And then at the end of the workshops, there was a plenary session. Everybody got back together, and Dr. King preached a sermon. And that was the first time I'd ever been present in hearing Dr. King preach a sermon. And then as soon as he finished his sermon, he came down from the pulpit and walked straight to the back of the church where the 5 of us were trying to hide under the balcony. And he he leaned down, and it seemed like a little smile or a little twinkle in his eye. He said, Mr. Zellner, unfortunately, the church is surrounded. The police are out there. There's news reporters out there, and the police have sent word that the 5 of you will be arrested. And I remember saying, Dr. King, we need to escape. And he kind of laughed and he said, well, you remember that little workshop we had about if you come, you better be prepared to be arrested. And we said, well, we are prepared to be arrested, but we need to escape if we can, because we don't want it to seem like we're demonstrating or taking sides. We were very reluctant revolutionaries at that time. And I remember Dr. King saying, well, I tell you what I'll do. I'll go out the front door, and if the police and the news reporters, if they all run around to the front door, Mrs. Parks and Reverend Abernathy can take you down to the basement, and there's a back door, and so they can open the back door and you can run for it. So that's what happened. And but the main thing that happened at that point was that as we were standing there waiting for the signal to come that Dr. King had gone out the front door, and we had people watching to see if the press and the police would go around to the front door. While we were waiting, Mrs. Rosa Parks touched me on this left elbow, and she said, Bob, when you and the other students see something wrong, you're going to have to do something. You can't study this forever. Something's going to happen in front of you someday, and you're going to have to take a side. And that was my commission in the civil rights movement. Yeah. So if you see anyone who was ever told by Mrs. Rosa Parks that they need to do something, they probably better get about the business of doing that. So that's what we began to do. Anyway, there's so much more to the story, but it's all in the book now. It's in The Wrong Side of Murder Creek. And a good bit of it is in the movie that's been made by Spike Lee and Barry Alexander Brown. Barry Brown is the director of the movie. He's from Montgomery. The whole movie was shot here in Alabama, part of it here in Baldwin County. And so hopefully people will be able to get a copy of that book. A new paperback has been put out since the movie is now done, so you can get it on paperback or get an old hardback and read the story. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. And if you're up for it, we do have some questions, and we've had comments coming in as you've been talking, and I'd love to share a few of those with you. First thing, just in terms of comments, lots of wows and that's incredible, and particularly in talking about some of the story of your father and his real conversion. And some of his experiences in Europe, really kind of remarkable. Just seeing lots of people kind of responding. A shout out to the sociologist in the room. There's some fellow sociologists, it appears. One question which you touched on a little bit. Do you have any thoughts or memories about John Lewis? Kind of any reflections? You started to mention the first time you met him. Any kind of reflections on him and his life?
Oh yes, I have. I think there's a little bit in the book about how John Lewis and I worked together. Our connections go way back to childhood, because John was raised on a sharecropping farm. Later, his own family's farm out from Troy, Alabama, and at that time. we lived in Slocum and in Newton, which is very close to the Dothan area. So we both grew up in the same area. And as a child, every summer, I had four brothers, Jim, Doug, David, and Malcolm. And during the summers, we would go to Uncle Harvey's sharecropper farm out from Dothan. And so we had very much similar experiences as children on the farm with chickens and cows and plowing and all of the things that go into making a southern sharecropper farm, because a lot of the work of a sharecropper farm is growing your own food. And now that we live in Fairhope, Alabama, in a really nice house with a big backyard, Pamela and I have a garden going out there. So, but John and I both grew up in the same part of Alabama. And John was also an aspiring preacher, and he did become a preacher. But John was a precocious warrior, because he heard Dr. King on radio and reached out to Dr. King and went when he was maybe 16 or 17 years old from Troy up to Montgomery to meet with Dr. King. And so he was always very close to Dr. King. So John Lewis, as chairman of SNCC, and me, as I was the first white Southerner to be a field secretary for SNCC, we were both always very close to and fond of and faithful followers of Dr. Martin Luther King. And John and I had similar experiences also as children, because we tried out, there's something about this spirit of struggle and fighting for what's right that happens at a very early age. And I think probably some of our listeners had that experience. So what is it at a very early age that made you interested in doing good things? And John's thing was to preach. So he practiced preaching with the chickens. He'd preach, and he tells stories about the chickens would, some would nod their heads and some would shake their heads. And he said, but they listened better than the members of Congress would usually listen to him. So he'd always tell funny stories about the chickens. And it reminded me of one of my childhood experiments with what later on I became much better at it. Even as a child, I wanted to practice nonviolence. I had a theory of nonviolence, and I practiced it in the 8th grade when in Daphne, Alabama, which is just 2 or 3 miles from where I now live. We moved. Daddy was serving the Methodist Church in Loxley, Alabama, and we were at one point when I was in the 8th grade. He was assigned to the United Methodist Church. No, it wasn't the United. It was just the Methodist Church in Daphne, and so here we were. I was probably 14 years old, I guess. And we're getting ready to move from Loxley to Daphne. And I knew that this is the routine we've been through every time we've moved. And in my whole life, we had moved every 3 or 4 years, because that's the way Methodist ministers do. And every time we moved, here's the Methodist preacher coming with 5 boys. And so we experienced severe bullying. And that's a question that people are facing now still in schools, because it seems to be some part of early childhood trauma. And for some reason, there's always been a phenomenon of bullying. So I remember my older brother Jim, we had to fight. Every time we moved to a new town, we had to fight the bullies because they would not leave you alone if you did not fight. And I thought to myself, as a 14-year-old, we're about to move and I'm going to have to fight. And so I told my brother Jim, I said, Jim, this time when we move, I'm not going to fight. And I remember Jim, my big brother, he said, little brother, I don't think that's a very good idea, because if you don't, they will make your life miserable. He said, you're going to have to fight. And he said, you're good at it, because I was a little bit heavier than Jim, and he had taught me very well about fighting. And he said, you're good at it. And he said, all you have to do is fight them one time and just show that you've got heart. And I said, well, that's ridiculous. Why do we have to fight? I'm not going to do it. I'm going to try not, I will not fight. I didn't say I'm not going to try not to fight. I said, I'm not going to fight. So when we moved to Daphne and school started that fall, of course, everybody on the recess on the playground, some people are bullies, and they will push around the other children, usually smaller children. And so they began to push me around, and I wouldn't fight back. And so pretty soon, everybody that wanted to be a bully was beating me up. So Mother finally said, and I would get sick. I was 14 years old and I didn't want to go to school. And I'd say, Mom, I'm sick. I can't go to school. And finally she said, well, something's happening at school and you're coming back all bruised up and everything. She said, is someone hurting you at school? And I said, yeah, they beat me up every day at recess. And Mother said, well, you're going to have to fight them. And I said, well, you and Daddy have always told us not to fight. We're not supposed to hit people and we're not supposed to fight. She said, well, this is different though. If you have bullies, you have to fight them. And then she called in my father, the Methodist minister, and he said, Bobby, you're just going to have to fight those boys. And like a minister, of course, he told me how to fight. He didn't show me how to fight, but he said, what I found the best thing to do with a bully is the first time they ever hit you is that you just hit them right on the end of the nose as hard as you possibly can hit them. And that's it. That's all you need to do. Because they are not going to fool with you anymore. So it was very typical that he would tell me how to fight rather than show me how to fight. But anyway, so I finally decided that I would have to fight the bullies. And I told my brother Jim, I said, oh my goodness gracious. I told my brother Jim that I'm going to fight today. So he said, okay, I'll be there. And so the first bully that I walked out of the porch on the school in Daphne, and one of them grabbed me from the behind, and they didn't expect me I was going to be a rag doll, and they could do whatever they wanted to with me. But I slung him like that around my shoulder, and I hit him with my fist. And my fist bounced off his jaw and hit the post that was down the steps of the school. And I remember looking at my hand, and I had knocked all the skin off my knuckles. And then Jim said he said, I never stopped walking forward. And whoever would stand up in front of me, I would fight them. And he said, after that, they never bothered me again. We could all be friends after that. But isn't that a ridiculous society, a culture that you have to be willing to fight? And so, in my study of history and my study of sociology, that's one of the characteristics of the South. The Tennessee, for instance, is known as the volunteer state because everybody in Tennessee, anytime there was war anywhere, they all volunteered to go fight. So we have to have a new way of conflict resolution, not only on school yards, but in counties, in states,
Congress.
in nations, in Congress, in the world, because we can't afford to, we have destructive weapons now that can destroy the earth, and we have destructive habits that can also ruin the climate and probably destroy human life, although the planet will be fine. 1,000 years from now, Earth will probably still be here and it'll be doing fine. There may not be any humans here, but it'll be fine. Thanks.
That's a good place to end, and certainly comments continue to come in, thanking you, saying always amazing, enlightening and educational. Certainly a good place to end by thinking about some of those deep patterns and looking towards the future of that. Very quick, kind of just logistical question. One question of, do you have any book signings scheduled? And then kind of related questions, what is the release date for the film and what's the title of the film?
Okay, I'm going to ask Pamela to talk about that because she's doing most of the work on promoting the film and working with the filmmakers.
Okay. Can you see me? Because there's something that popped up on our screen that I can't seem to get rid of.
Yep, we see you. Just
there we go. Okay. So we don't have a book signing scheduled right now due to the virus situation. But Bob is always happy to sign a book. So if anybody wants to get a hold of us, we will happily figure out a way to get that book signed. The movie is called Son of the South. And it's been picked up by a distributor, but because of COVID and how things are changing sort of moment to moment, we're hoping it's going to be released in theaters at the end of this year, or maybe the first of next year, but we really don't know anything definitive at the moment.
Son of the South.
Son of the
Son
South.
of the South, yeah. So if anybody wants a book signed, we could meet at Page and Palette in Fairhope. It's our local bookstore, and we try to buy a book at least once a month there. So come to Page and Palette and buy the book, and we can sit and talk and sign. Also, the film Son of the South debuted at the American Black Film Festival
in Miami
just 2 weeks ago?
That was more like a
month or so ago.
Yeah.
And the ending of the movie has been re-edited by Barry Brown to feature the performance of John Lewis. John Lewis is one of the characters in the movie. And the movie is dedicated to the memory of John Lewis. So, and I haven't seen, have you seen the latest? I don't think either one of us have seen the latest version of the movie. But because Barry is from Alabama, he was able to get tremendous production values out of, and also because he and Spike Lee had a successful film in the Academy Awards called Black Klansman. Because of that, they had access to a lot of really fine actors all over the world. So Brian Dennehy, one of the great actors of all times, played my grandfather the Ku Klux Klansman in the movie. So there's some outstanding actors in the movie, and they are all very excited about promoting the movie.
Well, that will be something for everyone to look forward to. Thank you for filling us in on those details. Still have a few more comments, just saying thank you so much. What an engaging experience. How wonderful to have the extra tribute to the amazing John Lewis that just came in. Look forward to purchasing the book. Thank you so much. Very inspiring from everyone. So lots of thank yous, lots coming in the comments. And I say thank you again so much for joining us. And I know everyone here would love to spend another hour talking, but unfortunately that's the time that we have. So thank you again. We really appreciate your joining us, and we look forward to seeing the film.
Thank you. Thank you so
Meg.
much.
Thank you. Bye.